So this year's Brazilian Grand Prix was one of the best in recent years, and it will be memorable for Max Verstappen slicing through the field to take the win in extremely tricky conditions. And yes, there were circumstances like rain and red flags. However, contrary to Lando Norris's explanation, it was a showcase of Max's talent and ability to grasp the situation at hand. And it was also a race where, like it or not, Lando Norris's title hopes were put to bed once and for all. But I sense Lando, ultimately, he's not a victim of the conditions, he's not a victim of not having the best car, he is a victim of hope, potentially false hope, that's been fed around him and built around him, and that's been just sort of floating around his name all season long. But just very quickly, click that little subscribe button below and also let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, speaking as a Williams fan, there was a point at the Grand Prix when both Alpines crossed the line second and third, and my first thought was, oh, bollocks. But shortly after, speaking first and foremost as an F1 fan, I'm actually very pleased for Alpine because this was a tiny glimpse of light in an otherwise very dark tunnel for most of the season. Now, luck and red flags and everything did play a part, but Alpine were just in the right place at the right time, and just when the team had lost all hope, they got both their drivers onto the podium. And the last time Alpine or Team Enstone had both drivers on the podium was at the 2013 South Korean Grand Prix with Kimi and Romain Grosjean, so a massive result for them. And for a team that has had the heart and soul ripped out of it by Renault CEOs who just want to sell you more EVs, for the regular men and women at the team, this is going to be the result of a lifetime for most of them. And let's not forget, it's a result that could potentially win them $50 million in the Constructors' Championship. And as long as it's not eaten up by self-awarded bonuses to the board of directors, then that should serve the team very, very well next season. So overall, fair play to Alpine, because for most of the season, there's been a bit of a vibe of abandon faith, all ye who enter here, coming out of Enstone. Now, moving on from the whole hopeless thing to the opposite end of the spectrum to look at McLaren and Williams, who were full of hope and optimism heading into the Brazilian Grand Prix. There were literal rays of sunshine coming out of both of these teams prior to the race. Especially McLaren, because after winning that sprint race, Lando Norris looked like he was now going to be full speed ahead in his push for the World Championship. It seemed that McLaren were in control, Oscar Piastri was just happy to do a job, so all Lando had to do was just extract the natural performance coming out of the car, and his natural talent just does the rest. And if you believe what the media were putting out, especially here in the UK, Lando was on course for a triumphant victory and to take a huge chunk out of Max's lead. Except no, that didn't happen. Lando got rustled into the first corner, a wet Grand Prix does its normal thing, and all hope for Lando just slipped away. And that's a fact, what's done is done, but the overall reaction to it and the perception of what actually happened, is I think that's where the trouble lies. Because of the desperation to see someone other than Max win a title from a percentage of the F1 universe, I do wonder if Lando Norris was incorrectly built up into something he isn't, a contender for the 2024 driver's title. Now, by all means, he could be a championship contender later down the line. Odds are he probably will, but to be claiming that he was one for this year's, looking at the points difference between him and Max, it was all looking a bit desperate. And although he's not mathematically out of it in the same way Charles Leclerc is, some of Club Lando might claim that the title battle is still on and it's still possible. And this is where the hope thing comes in, because chances are it's only going to be more miserable and more crushing once he's mathematically out of the equation. And it's also concerning when you see Norris in interviews claiming that he doesn't care about XYZ, or he's not interested in whatever Max Verstappen is doing. But he can say all that, but the issue is I don't believe him. I think he very much cares about these sorts of things. And I also wonder if he's potentially surrounded by people who are perhaps prematurely building him up into something he maybe isn't quite ready for yet. Maybe having that consistency to win a championship is something that he's not ready to do this season. Very easily could be next season or the one after, but just this season, it's not quite there yet. And I know in modern day F1, everything has to be now. The younger the driver winning the championship, the better. But look out through history, being potentially a late bloomer in Formula One, there's nothing wrong with that either. And this whole thing with the people around him building him up, and I'm not sure if it's yes men or whatever, but it's certainly people who will seriously benefit financially if Lando wins the title. So a big question to try and answer is, has Lando this season been inflated by false hope and expectations surrounding him this season? Now, he's a great driver, don't get me wrong, but by listening to potentially hype coming out of the media and placing him higher up a ladder than he really is, it's only going to hurt you, the fans, more when he falls. Because the result from the Brazilian Grand Prix will be even more devastating to him and his side of the garage, as any notions of a driver's title were crushed in an afternoon. And so Lando Norris, I do feel sorry for him in a way, because he's built up both false hope. He's a great driver, but there's also this sense of potentially British media who are desperate for a story and just a bit of hype surrounding his name. Ultimately, the clicks aren't going to click themselves, and merchandise isn't going to sell itself either. Now, in contrast, someone like Oscar Piastri, who hasn't really had any hopes or expectations surrounding him this season, but has also displayed loads and loads of talent, he has flourished as a driver this year. And also when you consider he has Mark Webber guiding him, one of the most no rubbish, say it how it is, feet firmly on the ground kind of guys out there, that is surely going to pay off for him later in his career. So Piastri, who has been winning races, getting results, but has still had to fall in line to help Lando Norris's title hopes, surely this is only going to light a fire underneath him for next season. But I doubt there's still going to be the same hype around him, because with Mark Webber in his corner, his feet are going to be firmly on the ground and he'll be taking each day as it comes. But also you have to consider that McLaren probably were not expecting to be in a Constructors' Championship battle. And if McLaren win the Constructors this year, it is going to be their first one since 1998. And what's even more depressing is that Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri weren't even born then, and it is a great reminder that the sands of time are depressingly slowly slipping away. And things do appear to be going in their favour, because Red Bull are basically running one car and Ferrari are doing Ferrari things. McLaren are on top because they have consistently done the best job of anyone else throughout the whole season. Now, you could argue that Lando is in the position he is in the championship because Red Bull and Max had that little mid-season wobble, but I'll let you guys argue about that in the comments. Because with the constructors more or less in the bag, and that being the only sure thing they can really focus on this season, surely it makes sense to double down on that. You know, rather than be upset about a drivers' championship that realistically was not going to happen. And before you say to yourself, yes, of course it would have happened, well, would you have put your money on it? Would you have really put your mortgage on it? I highly doubt it. And yes, Brazil for McLaren is one to forget, but they should still be content and confident because they are on course for their first Constructors' title in 26 years. But they're not, because hope reared its annoying head and led the team down a path that probably cost them in morale, resources, and other areas unnecessarily. Now, to be honest, it would be naive of me to think that McLaren would be content right now with just the Constructors' title. After all, no business is ever happy settling for anything, especially when lovely things like stakeholders and sponsors are involved. You've got to keep all those adorable people happy as well. Because if the team was called Zach Brown Racing and he owned the entire lot, he might be able to pull that off. But in any performance area based of work, if you achieve 110% of your target, they want 150% next week. So if there's anything good to take out of the Brazilian Grand Prix from McLaren, it's that this sort of result will snap them back into reality and it will push them to consolidate their position in the Constructors' Championship. Now, on the topic of false hope, I haven't even got started yet, because when you look at how Williams were positioned going into the Brazilian Grand Prix, everything was looking lovely. They were on a crest of a new wave. Colapinto was making headlines and putting in these great performances. And for a tiny slither of time, there was a small period in Q3 where it looked like it might all be coming together for Albon, who was on the front row. Well, for a little while he was anyway. And I bought into this. I really thought there was hope for a solid haul of points at the Grand Prix. And also, I was quite curious to see how Colapinto would do in a wet race. After all, South Americans seem to be pretty handy at wet Grand Prix, so we wanted to see if that followed the trend. And if Williams was powered alone by support from Argentinian fans, there'd be trophies all over the place right now. But where the situation at Williams is different to McLaren is that McLaren have been on a recovery effort since more or less 2018. So where McLaren are right now is the culmination of nearly 7 years worth of effort and hard work. Williams, on the other hand, only started getting it together in 2022 or 23, so when you compare that to the McLaren situation, there is still a hell of a long way to go. So in hindsight, it might have been a bit foolish to expect or hope a quick turnaround in fortunes. And that only made things more painful, because that was the worst weekend that Williams could have had. Alex and Franco both Loganed it into the barriers over the course of the weekend and could only get one car on track due to the extent of the damage caused. And also getting leapfrogged by Alpine by a points margin that is now unrecoverable. It's going to be another 9th place finish by the look of things. A loss of many millions of dollars, and I do wonder how much of that prize money was factored into paying Carlos Sainz for next season. It does make you think. Now, I don't want to come across as a negative Nigel talking about hope and false hope in Formula One, but it's just one of these sports where it's so easy to let hype and your imagination just run away. Basically, to let your heart overrule your head and you come away disappointed or maybe even angry, to which then some of you vent on a social media outlet of your choosing. So rather than lap up whatever extravagant story that the media is putting out there that suits whatever your heart says, whether it's a title push from Norris or another Daniel Ricciardo return, or maybe even Mick Schumacher getting a drive, just run it through a filter in your brain first. Because after what happened in Brazil from a Williams perspective, of course the drivers were going to have a tough time. Maybe not the disaster that it was, but that's ultimately where they are right now. Alpine's podium was a real poke in the eye, and overall now Williams are 9th, but ultimately you've got to admit, that is where they deserve to be. Had James Vowles been a bit more decisive and fired Sargent at the end of 2023, it may have been different, but it's all part of the learning curve, apparently. Still, it could be worse. You could be a Sauber fan. So anyway, guys, thank you so much. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.